Welcome to this lecturette on communication. In this lecturette, we will look to answer the following key questions. What is communication? Where is communication? When is communication? What are the different ways of thinking about communication? And how communication makes our environment. What is communication? Communication is derived from the Latin words communicare and communis. Communicare means to make common, to participate, to unite and to impart. Communis means to share and to belong to all. Another important element of this is the word communion. Part of communication is the common participation and sharing, the participatory process that we engage in, as well as the close relationships in the group. So communication brings within itself several meanings: to share, to unite, to participate, to belong to all, something that we all engage in. At its most basic, communication can be summarized as the activity of imparting or transmitting messages. These messages contain information, ideas, knowledge, attitude. Communication also is the activity of the dialogue, the exchange, the interaction, the intercourse. Think of it as a conversation. There is a back and forth, there's a transmission, there's an exchange, and there's a sharing of information. Now, it's very important to understand that communication is not always instrumental or planned. It is not always a strategic and tactical activity, an activity that we engage in a very considered way, with a particular outcome in mind, with a particular set of processes in mind, hoping to achieve a particular end. Communication is not always just about the professional practice that we engage in, be it as a designer, be it as a journalist, a public relations practitioner, and so on. And communication is not particularly just about the economic activity of engaging in a professional practice. So what we're saying here is that we have to think about communication as being more than an instrumentalist planned activity which is designed to achieve particular outcomes, have particular outputs, to persuade, to educate, and so on. It is not about what we do as an economic activity within a particular field or discipline. In fact, communication is in itself quite banal and ordinary. There's nothing special about it. It is lived and everyday practice. It's experienced by all of us, and it is practiced by all of us. It is something that's ubiquitous, it's omnipresent, it's everywhere. So communication is something that we don't need to privilege, or we don't need to beatify. Communication is at its essence something that's quite banal, quite ordinary, that we engage in every day, that we experience and practice on ourselves, and that is present everywhere. So where is communication? Communication is everywhere. It's all around you, and it's in everything that is around you. If you look at your immediate environment, you'll realize that everything is telling a story. Everything is communicating ideas, information, attitudes to you. The walls, the colors, the pictures, the objects, this lecturette, your clothes, it is all engaging in communication. So communication is everywhere and in everything. You cannot not communicate. Every artifact is designed, in effect, to tell you something. When is communication? Well, it's everywhere all the time. It's anytime. If everything communicates to you all the time, communication is everywhere, anytime. So at no point can you not be communicating something. Even silence in itself is part of the communication process. So communication is ordinary, communication is banal, it's everyday, it's practiced all around us, by everything. All objects and artifacts around us are part of the communication process and are communicating to us at the same time. It helps to think of communication in particular ways. The communication that we're most familiar with is interpersonal communication. That is communication that happens between people. I'm saying something, you're listening, there is an exchange of information. It's between people, interpersonal communication. We practice it in a variety of ways. We do it by talking to each other. We do it by sending each other messages, emails, SMSs, and so on. But we also engage in it in non-verbal and verbal ways. Sometimes messages are communicated quite explicitly in that they're verbalized. Sometimes they're communicated in a less implicit way, in a non-verbal way, through gestures, through body language, through what you might wear, also through the way you look at someone. All those things are part of how you communicate what needs to be said. Now you can engage in this at a one-to-one level, me talking to you, you listening to me and responding back, or you can have it at a one-to-many level, as we have when we have a lecture where there's one person speaking and there's a lot of you listening. Very much like when you're watching television or reading the newspapers, listening to the radio. There's one person engaging in a one-to-many communication. This is also sometimes known as broadcast. The other complication or nuance to communication is intercultural communication, the communication that happens between cultures. Not everybody communicates in the same way and not all meaning is fixed. So when we are working across cultures, communication actually becomes a more complicated activity, one that requires a bit more effort and work on our parts. So intercultural communication is one quite significant form of communication. The type of communication that we're most familiar with is what we call mass communication, where one message is being broadcast out to a large audience. So television, radio, newspapers are the more traditional forms of mass communication. One message that goes out to a large audience, at some extent an undifferentiated audience. It is the type of communication that we're most familiar with and that mostly drives the current media models. The new model of thinking around communication is networked communication. This is stuff like the internet, social media, and community media, where you're having a communicative event over a network. So it's not necessarily one-to-many, it can be many-to-many, or it can be any-to-many. So Facebook will be a good example of a network communication, although it's moving towards a more closed system, towards a more mass communication model. Now, at its most basic, we think of communication with four different ideas. Communication as transmission, the sending of information. Communication as exchange, where information is exchanged between people or between organizations and so on. I tell you something, you respond back. In the transmission model, we're talking more just about sending of the information. In the exchange model, we're talking about information coming back and there being a back and forth. Communication is also about the communication as meaning, and we'll talk about that more in another lecture. The other part is communication as discourse. Communication happens within a space where you're competing and there's a lot of different communicative events and artifacts engaging with each other and against each other, and as such communication has to work in a sea of ideas. So communication as transmission is the sending of information. Communication as exchange is when information can be got back, there's a back and forth. Communication as meaning is about communication where you're sending particular ideas, particular attitudes, and discourse is when communication happens in a sea of other text. Now we'll talk more about this in the lecturette Models of Communication. Now this is a quote from Raymond Williams, and it's a fairly large quote and I've put it there because I think it's really important to help us understand what is it about communication that is interesting. Now he says that his view is that we have been wrong in taking communication as secondary. Many people assume that as a matter of course there is first reality and then communication about reality. As such, we degrade art and learning by supposing that they are always second-hand activities, that there is life and then afterwards there are accounts of it. He goes on to say, the struggle to learn, to describe, to understand, to educate is central and a necessary part of our humanity. And this struggle is not begun at a second hand, after reality has occurred. This struggle, it is in itself a major way in which reality is continually formed and changed. So as an example, he says, what we call society is not only a network of political and economic arrangements, but it is also a process of learning and communication. Now, what's really important here is that Raymond Williams is talking about the fact that communication is very much part of how we make our reality, how we understand our reality. So it is not just about communicating what we are experiencing or what is happening to us, but it is very much part of the process that defines what is happening to us and what we are engaging in. So communication is very much part of how we construct, how we understand what is happening around us, how we construct our humanity and our environment. And I think this is a really important element of communication, to always remember that it's not just about the data, the information, the knowledge, the ideas and the attitudes, but it is also about how we then form and understand these attitudes, ideas and information. So this is a really important distinction when we talk about communication. We need to be very aware that it is not just the act of sending out, but it's about the formation of identity. Now, Williams in another book talks about society is a form of communication through which experience is described, shared, modified and preserved. That's really important. So he's making the link between communication as a practice that we engage in, but how in communication helps us to share that experience, how we describe that experience, how that experience is modified, how that experience is preserved. And the society is not just about power, property and production, but it's also about learning, persuading and the exchanging of information, that is communication. So that is a really important thing to keep in mind, that communication is not only a part of sense making, understanding of what's happening, it is also how we construct our environment, how the media around us, all the forms of information and how we control that information and transmit and contain that information, helps us understand how our environment is constructed and how we understand our environment. So we cannot divorce communication as a process from communication as a way of understanding and a way of constructing what our environment and reality is. In order to further understand this lecture, it would really help you to answer the following 3 questions. What is the difference between the banal and ordinary communication and strategic tactical communication? Use examples that you've engaged in or in your experience to explain the difference. Then, look around your immediate environment. Note down all the objects that are communicating to you, and there will be plenty. What are they communicating to you, and how are they communicating to you? Finally, consider your daily practices, what you do every day. What types of communication do you engage in? Pick one type of communication and explain using examples how you engage in that type of communication. Thank you very much for listening.